The sunset in New York cast a cold gold across the penthouse living room of Julian Vance, the most talked-about 35-year-old man on Wall Street and in Silicon Valley. He wasn't just a billionaire. Julian was a myth. Nicknamed the Oracle for his uncanny precision in predicting market crashes and peaks, he was a cynical recluse who treated humanity as a complex algorithm, one he had mastered and, frankly, found tedious. Julian was not the kind of man who enjoyed the spotlight, but his image was unmistakable. Tall, athletic, with dark hair always impeccably slicked back and piercing blue eyes that seemed to analyze your balance sheet as you talked about the weather. His usual expression was one of polite disinterest, which only made him more intimidating. He wore a perfectly tailored gray suit, expensive enough to support a family for a year, but which looked like a uniform, an armor against the world. But before we delve into this story of greed and revelations, a small warning. If you love narratives that make you question what truly holds value, and if you are moved by breathtaking plot twists, hit the subscribe button right now and turn on the bell notification so you don't miss any story. That night, however, there was a chilly glint of anticipation in his gaze, something that broke the monotony of his pose. He had summoned the four women who, in one way or another, orbited his small, luxurious universe. The atmosphere was heavy, filled with the scent of polished marble and rare flowers, but it was the unspoken tension that suffocated the air. The four were seated in designer chairs in the center of a room that looked more like a private museum. Julian slides his hand over the ebony surface of the coffee table, polished to a mirror shine, and smiles, a gesture more calculating than affectionate. "Thank you for coming, ladies," he begins, his voice low and controlled with a timbre that demanded silence. "And forgive the informality. But what I am about to present to you today is not a dinner. It is an experiment." With a precise, almost theatrical movement, he places four objects on the table. They were not jewels nor contracts, but four black credit cards, the most exclusive kind, the ones with a physical weight and a financial limit that is only an urban legend, because in practice it is unlimited. Julian's fiancée, Veronica St. Clair, immediately leans forward. Veronica, at 30, was the epitome of the luxury influencer. Platinum blonde with a perfectly tanned, gym-toned body, she was always flawlessly made up and accessorized with the latest designer pieces. Her personality was a performance, full of practiced laughs and an obsession with being the central figure in any photo. Her greatest internal conflict was the constant fear that her status and beauty were perishable assets, which led her to a relentless search for validation. "Julian, darling, what is this?" she asks, trying to sound amused, but with a barely concealed note of greed. "Presents? You know I've been eyeing that new diamond watch." Julian doesn't even look at her. His gaze sweeps over the other three. Next to Veronica sits Serena Harding, Julian's personal lawyer. 39 years old, with a sharp black bob haircut and a high-fashion suit that looked like it had been sculpted onto her body. Serena exuded the essence of power, and I have the proof on my resume. She was brilliant, relentless, and tired of being second in command. Her desire for influence drove her to work 18 hours a day. Her brown eyes, usually cold and calculating, now gleamed with fierce curiosity. "Have we signed a new confidentiality agreement, Julian?" Serena questions, her voice slightly rough, already in negotiation mode. She didn't want presents. She wanted the key to the vault. Then there was Chloe Davis, the personal assistant, 28 years old, pale and wearing thin-rimmed glasses that made her look even more overwhelmed. Her clothing, though quality, was always discreet, as if she wanted to blend into the wallpaper. Chloe was loyal to Julian not out of love or admiration, but out of necessity. She supported her elderly parents, and the financial security of working for the Oracle was her lifeline. Her conflict was visible in the way she wrung her hands in her lap. She wanted to be recognized for her competence, but feared asking for anything that might break the fragile balance of her life. "Is it some kind of bonus for that negotiation in Singapore?" Chloe whispers, her voice hesitant. And last but not least was Elara. She was the social contrast point in the room. 25 years old, Julian's discreet maid. While the others wore silk and diamonds, Elara wore her impeccable but plain uniform. She had a classic beauty, with brown hair pulled back in a simple bun and deep green eyes that observed the world without judgment, but with a quiet intelligence. Elara didn't bow to luxury. She cleaned it. Her past, a well-kept secret, was that of a promising former art student who dropped out of college due to family obligations. Her only accessory was a worn beaded bracelet, a gift from her sister. Elara merely observed the scene, standing near the door, not moving toward the table. She asked no questions. She waited. Julian then picks up one of the black cards. "This is not a gift," he explains, allowing the tension to build. "This is a social test. 4 souls, 4 unlimited black cards. The experiment. What will you do with absolute financial power when the only restraint is your own moral compass?" He extends his hand with the cards for each to take hers. Veronica grasps it with her fingertips as if it were a jewel. Serena takes it with the firmness of someone holding a judge's gavel. Chloe slides it into her skirt pocket as if afraid of being robbed. Julian turns to Elara. "Elara, you are included. You are the only person in this apartment who sees the inner workings of my life without the social armor. Your perspective is the most important to me." Elara stares at him for an instant, those green eyes seeming to pierce the billionaire's cynical facade. She merely nods and takes the card with a disturbing calm. "The rule of the game is simple," Julian continues, now standing, walking slowly around the room like a predator. "You have 48 hours, starting now. Use the card any way you wish. What you buy, what you invest, what you spend, will be analyzed by me. In the end, there will be an unrevealed prize, something that will change one of your lives. A prize I reserve for the person who proves to me that there is still something of value in the world that cannot be bought." He stops in front of the immense window overlooking Central Park. "Go. Show me who you really are." When no one else is looking, the hook was cast. The audience wondered, what did Julian, the billionaire who already had everything, consider a life-changing prize? And more importantly, what would these 4 women do with absolute power in their hands? The meeting dissolved into a murmur of silk and hidden intentions. As the elevator doors closed, taking the 4 women out into the nocturnal frenzy of Manhattan, Julian retreated to his control office, a discreet room behind a bookshelf that concealed high-resolution screens and state-of-the-art financial monitoring systems. He sat down, took a glass of whiskey, and smirked. The hunt had begun. 4 risk profiles, he whispered to himself, turning on the system that would track the transactions, and 4 ways to fail. Julian knew his inner circle better than they imagined. Veronica St. Clair, the fiancée, the pursuit of status, vanity. Veronica's profile was predictable, and that was precisely what bored him. She was the perfect product of selfie culture and instant validation. Her body was her currency, her Instagram feed, her balance sheet. Veronica spent not to own, but to appear to own. So the world would envy the life she pretended to live. Physically, she had an almost plastic beauty, the result of subtle surgeries and rigorous training, which Julian saw as proof of her superficiality. She was remodeling the facade without ever touching the foundation. Her personality was a volatile mix of forced charm and latent insecurity. She felt that if Julian left her, she would revert to being just Veronica from Long Island, not Mrs. Vance. The black card for her was an opportunity to seal her status, to silence the haters, and to prove she belonged. She wouldn't buy, she would invest in her personal brand. Veronica's conflict was that in trying to prove her worth, she would inevitably prove her lack of depth. Serena Harding, the lawyer, the desire for power and influence. Serena was a different challenge. She didn't seek Veronica's superficial shine. She wanted real power, the kind that truly shapes the world. Her appearance was an extension of her ambition, strong, without unnecessary embellishments, but always the best quality. The blazer was not clothing. It was combat uniform. Her brown eyes, which were the only part of her that didn't seem totally under control, sometimes revealed a deep fatigue and the frustration of hitting the glass ceiling. Serena wanted to be the first woman to run one of the big New York law firms, and the black card was not for bags or shoes. It was for opening doors, for buying the access that her talent alone hadn't yet secured. She would buy influence, partnerships, and positions. Her conflict was that in wanting power at all costs, she was willing to sacrifice her integrity. Chloe Davis, the assistant. Forced loyalty and the desire for recognition. Chloe was the shadow, thin, with pale skin from too much time in the office. She was the person who ensured Julian's world ran smoothly. She yearned for recognition but sought it in a twisted way, through submission and the anticipation of Julian's desires. Her conflicts were the most complex. She needed the money for her family but feared spending it on herself, afraid Julian would see her as greedy and fire her. Her personality was one of nervous quietness, always apologizing even when there was no reason. For her, the card was a double trap. She could help her family, but if she did, Julian might think she was selfish. She would opt almost certainly to please him. Elara, the maid, social contrast, and the mysterious past. Elara was the variable that made the experiment interesting to Julian. Her beauty was not ostentatious but elegantly lined, reminding him of the old masters she had studied so much. She had firm hands from working and a posture that, despite the uniform, denoted an innate dignity. Her past was the tip of the iceberg. A brilliant student at Parsons who had to drop out of the fine arts course to care for her younger sick sister. The cleaning job, the most invisible of all, was her means of paying bills without begging. Her greatest conflict was not with money, but with the abandoned dream. She was not interested in luxury. What moved her was a sense of duty. She looked at the card as a useless piece of plastic until it could transform into something that genuinely made a difference. What she would do with it was the only thing Julian could not predict. Julian leans back in his chair, the monitors displaying the virtual balances of the 4 accounts. The rule, ladies is the only thing that matters, he thinks, reviewing the recording of his ultimatum. You have 48 hours. What you buy tells what you value. There is no cheating. The money is unlimited, but the judgment is eternal. And the prize will not be money. It will be the chance to have a life worth living. He picks up his phone, which shows the time 7 p.m. The countdown had begun. Let the games begin, Julian murmurs, as the first transaction notifications start popping up on the screen tracking the cards, and, predictably, Veronica's is the first to flash red. The tension was in the air, the stage set for the revelation of each one's true ambitions. Who would come out on top? Who would prove to Julian that his cynicism was merely a defense against hope? The clock kept ticking. The first night was a symphony of electronic notifications in Julian's cockpit. He observed the screens with the coldness of a scientist in a laboratory, analyzing the predictability of human behavior under the microscope of unlimited wealth. Disappointment was a familiar feeling for him, and that night seemed only to reinforce his cynicism. Veronica, the fiancée, was the quickest to succumb to temptation. In less than 3 hours, her black card statement was a monument to futility. She started with the basics, a Fifth Avenue shopping spree, buying rare handbags, haute couture dresses that would be worn only once for a post, and, of course, the diamond watch she had mentioned. But the real blunder came when she moved from ostentation to social proof. She bought an obscure digital art NFT, non-fungible token, valued at millions not for appreciating the art, but to be the first in her circle to own something so ridiculously exclusive and, most importantly, to be able to flaunt it on her social media with the caption, "Investing in the future." Babes, Veronica had turned Julian's test into public theater. In the security video of a luxury jeweler, Julian saw her filming herself with the watchbox open, smiling at her cell phone camera, but the smile disappeared the instant she stopped recording, replaced by an empty grimace. She wasn't happy. She was just ticking an item off her socially dictated wish list. Pathetic, Julian muttered, shaking his head. She bought approval, but not happiness itself. Serena, the lawyer, on the other hand, acted with surgical precision. She didn't want things. She wanted leverage. Her card notifications were less frequent but much more strategic. The first massive expenditure was the purchase of a substantial share of a high-ranking contemporary art gallery in Chelsea. It wasn't a personal investment. It was a power move. She wants a seat at the table with the big patrons, Julian deduced, seeing the electronic documents of the transaction. She wants to network with the bankers and tycoons who frequent the opening. Serena's second expenditure was even more revealing. She hired the best and most expensive lobbyist in Washington, D.C. to work on legislation that would benefit one of the country's largest tech companies, a bold move that would put her in direct contact with the legislature and open doors to board positions that were previously closed. She was brazenly buying influence and access. Julian saw her on a secret Zoom call from her office, smiling fiercely at the lobbyist, her eyes glinting with the promise of power. Her ambition was enviable, but it was rooted in an insatiable thirst for control, for being the person who pulled the strings. She's not testing the card. She's testing the limits of the system, Julian reflected, feeling a pang of professional respect, quickly followed by a deep ethical disappointment. She would buy a soul if she could, as long as it was well documented. And then there was Chloe, the assistant. Her case was the saddest for Julian. She didn't think of herself or even her family. Her purchases were all directed at him. Chloe bought a rare batch of vintage French wines that Julian had mentioned casually months ago. She bought a first edition of a book he had been looking for years. She even bought a new state-of-the-art air filtration system for the apartment, which he had complained was defective. Julian watched a recording of her in a collector's item store. She was anxious, almost trembling, and called his office to make sure of the color of a pen holder. "Do you think Mr. Vance would like this navy blue, or would matte black be better?" "I don't want to get it wrong," she said to the seller, her voice crushed by the pressure. Julian turned off Chloe's monitor with a heavy sigh. She was using the unlimited card to continue her assistant work, but with a limitless budget. She wasn't seeking her own recognition, but the boss's approval, showing her submission and forced loyalty. She hadn't freed herself with the money. She had only chained herself more firmly to her role. "All three," Julian spoke to the empty room, "proved my algorithm correct. Money doesn't change who you are. It just amplifies your essence. Vanity, ambition, submission. The night wore on and the spending frenzy peaked. 3 of the cards were in digital flames, but there was a disturbing silence. Elara's card, the 4th on Julian's screen, remained strangely quiet. The screen, which should have been flashing green with transactions, was static, displaying the number 0.20 as a silent challenge. Julian checked the system twice, thinking there might be a software error. Maybe she's afraid to use it, he pondered, skepticism still governing him. The inertia of poverty. She doesn't feel worthy of the power. 8 hours passed. Nothing. 12 hours. Absolute silence. 24 hours. The only transaction in the last hours was a $5 purchase by Veronica at a convenience store to buy an energy drink to continue online. Shopping and another $10,000 in anonymous donations from Serena to her new lobby. But Elara's card showed no sign of life. Julian's skepticism began to turn into a deep curiosity and, more dangerously, a sliver of hope. He activated the discreet GPS tracking that was linked to everyone's phones, a company security clause, he claimed, and tuned into the security camera covering the service exit and employee area. The narrative follows Elara. She was outside Julian's luxurious apartment, but she wasn't in malls or jewelry stores. Elara was in Queens, in a neighborhood that smelled of street food and real life, far from the clean marble scent of Julian's penthouse. She wasn't dressed in finery. She still wore simple clothes, having only changed her work uniform for an old coat and faded jeans. She was sitting on a bench in a modest square, watching children play. She was not buying. She was just looking. She was looking at a window on the upper floor of an old apartment building, where she knew her chronically ill sister was struggling to have better days. Elara didn't want the money for herself. She wanted to take her out of that place and pay for the treatment that Julian's insurance, ironically, didn't fully cover. Later that day, the narrative shows her in an even more surprising place. She visited a local orphanage, a place she used to go to as a child and where she returned to help clean and organize. She talked to the director, Mrs. Rodriguez, a warm woman with calloused hands. "We just need some basic repairs, dear." Mrs. Rodriguez sighed, gesturing to a roof that needed urgent repairs. "But the cost, it's unaffordable. The annual budget is already gone." Elara didn't pull out the card right away. She just absorbed the information, her green eyes sweeping over the simple joy of the children playing in contrast to the decaying infrastructure. She understood the weight of unaffordability. Julian, watching her on his screen, saw the difference. While the others were consuming, Elara was only observing her own world, the real world which Julian's fortune had forced her to leave. She didn't have the greed or ambition of the others, but she had something Julian had lost, a visceral connection to need and suffering. "She's not buying," Julian murmured, stirring the ice in his glass. "She's pondering the value." He realized she wasn't afraid to spend, but afraid to spend wrongly. She was wrestling with the moral dilemma of using money from someone she barely trusted for a purpose that could be considered selfish, helping her sister, or grand, helping the community. The tension grew for Julian. He expected a slip-up, an impulsive purchase, but the silence continued, strong and heavy, until only 4 hours remained in the 48-hour experiment. The only thing Elara had bought so far was a cereal bar at a corner store, paid for with cash. Elara's silence was louder than the noise of the other three's transactions, and Julian, the cynic, was suddenly hooked. He was anxious to see what her silence would produce. Time was almost up. Julian's screen flashed with the countdown, 0:03:59. Veronica, Serena, and Chloe's cards were exhausted, but Julian's virtually infinite limit never blinked. What did blink hypnotically was Elara's screen, still at 0 in stark contrast to the millions the others had spent. Julian was tense in his chair, elbows resting on his knees, staring at the monitors. "Come on, Elara," he muttered. "Show me. Tell me who you are." With the countdown reaching 0:01:30, Elara's screen finally lit up. Julian felt a rush of adrenaline. The first transaction from Julian Vance, the fake name he had put on the card for security, appeared. Value, 0.00. Julian blinked. This didn't make sense. He magnified the screen, which showed an electronic receipt. Elara had used the card to make a micro-donation to a random New York charity, exactly 0.00 with a test note. The charity in question was one he had founded to test bugs in his financial system. He scoffed, frustrated. "A test? Is she testing if the card works? Seriously?" The cynicism returned with force. He had expected a master stroke, but it seemed Elara was just afraid to press the buy button. But the confusion didn't last long. Just 10 seconds before the deadline expired, euro 10, a second transaction surged onto the screen, overlaying the countdown. Julian's system began to vibrate. The value was not a value. It was a complex transaction name, a sequence of legal names and a large number. Hospital system debt administrative transaction, full payment, $12,800,000, and Julian's jaw almost dropped. $12,800,000. In a single transaction, Elara had eclipsed the total sum of all of Veronica's luxury purchases. But the money hadn't gone to a handbag or an NFT. It had been directed to something called Hospital System Debt Full Payment. Julian accessed the transaction link. Elara hadn't just paid for her sister's treatment or even her family's individual debt. She had paid the entirety of the patient debt of a charity hospital in Brooklyn, the same hospital where her sister was receiving treatment. It was an institution that served uninsured or underinsured people, a systemic problem, not an individual one. The transaction wasn't a purchase. It was an acquisition of responsibility. Elara used the card to pay the debt, transforming a financial problem into community relief, and the remaining money, a few million, which the main transaction didn't cover, she had used to open a legally complex trust account, which would ensure the hospital could operate without creditor pressure for a long time. She hadn't simply given money. She had used legal and financial power to dismantle a bureaucratic knot. The clock struck 0. Julian leaned back in his chair, eyes wide in shock. "Damn," he whispered for the first time in his life without a calculated answer. She didn't buy an item. She bought financial freedom for hundreds of families. She used the card as a weapon of social impact. Julian smiled, but this time it wasn't a cynical smile. It was a smile of pure admiration. The experiment hadn't failed. It had produced a result that was outside his predictability matrix. The Elara variable was indeed the most fascinating. Exactly 1 hour after the test ended, the 4 women were summoned to Julian's projection room, a minimalist space with gray walls and a huge screen that descended from the ceiling. The tension in the room was palpable, like the calm before a storm. Veronica was radiant, convinced that her investment in NFT and her social visibility had been the master stroke. Serena was postured like someone ready to negotiate the prize. Chloe was almost on the verge of tears, worried about having spent too much despite her efforts to please him. Elara was silent, standing at the back, unusually calm amidst the others' nervousness. Julian entered the room with a calm stride, but his blue eyes were intense. He wasn't angry. He was sad, and that cold sadness was far more devastating. "Thank you for participating," he began, his voice resonating in the silence. "The 48-hour experiment has ended. Now the moment of truth." He gestured to the screen, which lit up with the first photo, Veronica in front of a mannequin at Chanel, with a forced smile on her face. Next, the screen displayed a detailed graph of her purchases: bags, shoes, and the climax, the NFT. "Veronica," Julian said with a coldness that cut the air, "your total expenditure, almost $3 million. Could you explain the rationale behind buying an NFT that isn't even real art?" Veronica immediately defended herself with a shrill tone of someone being wronged. "But Julian, it's an investment in my brand. I need to prove to my followers that I'm ahead of the curve. It's social media, it's networking. Don't you understand? It's our reputation." Julian shook his head slowly. "I understand the concept of reputation, Veronica. What I don't understand is why you would use an unlimited card to buy the validation of strangers. Your money wasn't spent to enrich your life. It was spent to reinforce the cage of vanity you live in. You proved that with all the money in the world, your greatest desire is to be envied." The screen changed. Now it displayed a discreet security video of Serena, quietly discussing with the lobbyist the need to crush the competition and the list of gala dinners she had bought access to. "Serena," Julian continued, turning to the lawyer, "you invested your time and my money, about $5 million, to position yourself socially and professionally. Excellent strategy. But you spent on access and influence. You weren't buying an opportunity to do good. You were buying the right to sit closer to those with power. If you had to choose between the law and profit, what would you do?" Serena was not intimidated. "I invested in my rise, Julian. I deserve this power. It's what moves the world. What did you expect? That I buy food for beggars? I'm an ambitious woman, and you? You value ambition. I value the ambition that builds, Serena, not the one that only climbs on others' backs," Julian corrected, his voice becoming slightly tenser. "You proved to me that your talent is subordinate to your thirst for control." The screen then displayed the long list of gifts for Julian made by Chloe. The wine, the rare book, the air filter. Chloe winced. "And you, Chloe," Julian said, his voice softer but still laden with disappointment. "You spent almost $1 million and you didn't buy a single thing for yourself. Not one thing for your sick sister or your parents." Chloe started to cry. "I just wanted you to see that I'm indispensable. I'm loyal. I know what you need. I thought if I used the card to please you, you would see me as a valuable partner, not just your assistant. You used the money to reinforce your submission," Julian concluded, the sadness now visible on his face. "Unlimited money didn't give you freedom. It just gave you a more expensive form of servitude." The room fell into a crushing silence. The first three women were unmasked. Their ambitions, vanity, power, and submission, had been exposed and condemned not with anger, but with the cold sadness of the billionaire who saw his last glimpse of faith in humanity fade. Julian then turned, and the screen changed one last time, displaying only the transaction value: 12,800,000 Borer, hospital system debt full payment. He looked at Elara, who was standing at the back, motionless. The central conflict had been established: the superficiality of greed versus the depth of a single altruistic act. The game was about to change again. The air was so heavy it was hard to breathe. The value of Elara's transaction hovered on the screen, an eloquent silence that crushed the excuses and egos of Veronica. Serena and Chloe. Julian turned to the three women, who were visibly shaken and humiliated. He was no longer cold. There was an unexpected vulnerability in his expression, something he rarely allowed anyone to see. He walked to the center of the room and looked at the floor for a moment, as if gathering the courage to confess a secret. "Do you see those numbers on the screen?" Julian asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. $12 million. It sounds like a lot, doesn't it? Enough to change many people's lives. But for me, it's a drop in the ocean. He looked at Serena, his lawyer, who seemed to be preparing to object. "Do you think I ran this test to find a wife or a business partner or a new assistant?" He paused, a bitter smile playing on his lips. "That's the irony, Serena. I wasn't looking for someone to help me make more money. I was desperately looking for someone to help me spend the money I already had." The room fell into an even deeper silence. Veronica looked at him, confused. "Spend? But you're the oracle. You're the master of finance." "Yes, and that's my curse," Julian countered, with a tone of confession that was almost painful to hear. "I spent the last decade of my life developing an algorithm for success, piling up wealth. But success, it left me completely empty. I'm a billionaire who can no longer buy sleep. I saw what money does to people, what it did to you, and what it was doing to me, turning me into a cynical recluse, unable to trust anyone close. Julian gestured to the vastness of the luxury penthouse outside the projection room. All of this is a golden prison. I was planning to donate the majority of my fortune, billions of dollars anonymously, start a massive foundation, dedicated to solving systemic problems, not just giving handouts. I didn't want the credit. I just wanted this wealth to do some good before I went crazy with it. He ran a hand through his hair, visibly frustrated. But I am paralyzed, trapped by bureaucracy, by the fear of being exploited, by the fear that as soon as I handed the money over to any of you, he looked at the three of them, it would be immediately diverted to jewelry, political networking, or office bribes. I needed one person. A single person who had the vision, the altruism, and crucially the integrity to execute this. Someone who saw money not as an end, but as a tool for purpose. Julian the cynic was emotionally exposed. He had revealed that the test wasn't about them, but about his own existential crisis. He didn't want a romantic partner. He wanted a partner in impact. He turned to Elara, who was still silent. The test was not about who could flaunt the most. It was about who could ignore the temptation to flaunt and instead see the need. Julian began to walk slowly toward Elara, who was standing in the corner of the room. Everyone's eyes in the room were fixed on her. The confrontation was no longer about Julian and the others, but about Julian and Elara. Elara, Julian began, his voice now imbued with a cautious reverence. Almost $13 million. You could have paid for your art college, bought your house, traveled the world, but you paid the hospital debt. Why? Why didn't you buy anything for yourself? I gave you an unlimited opportunity, and you used it to solve a problem that wasn't even yours. Elara took a deep breath, and when she spoke, her voice was clear, calm, and resonated louder than the others' panic-stricken tones. Mr. Vance, she said without stammering, I didn't buy anything for myself because I knew that if I did, I would be missing the only thing that truly mattered in this test. She gestured toward the black card she still held. True wealth is not spent. It is directed. Spending is feeding an ego. Directing is feeding a community, she explained, her voice tinged with emotion but without faltering. My sister is in that hospital. I saw Mrs. Rodriguez, the orphanage director, struggling. I saw families being destroyed by medical debt, not by a lack of willingness to work. Paying my sister's debt would have been personal relief. Paying the system's debt allowed hundreds of other sisters, children, and parents to receive treatment without the threat of bankruptcy. That is value. It is not luxury. Julian shook his head. But what did you do with the remaining money, Elara? You used the legal and administrative transaction to create a reserve. Why didn't you use everything to pay the hospital? Elara smiled slightly, and it was the first time Julian had seen a genuine smile on her face. I used the rest to fund a new scholarship program for underprivileged art students at my old college. It's the dream I had to abandon, Mr. Vance. It's my tribute to all the people who had to sacrifice their dreams because of need. She didn't ask for credit, nor the job, nor the marriage. She sought real change, transforming her past sacrifice into opportunity for others. Then, in a surprising move, she flipped the script. She looked directly into the eyes of Julian, the cynical billionaire. Now let me ask you something, Mr. Vance, she challenged him softly, keeping her voice firm. You are the Oracle. You have the power to change the world, not just Wall Street. You saw all the horrible things money can do. But why were you here playing games with us? Why did you? Who could have activated this army of lawyers to start your foundation years ago? Test me instead of acting. You were afraid, Mr. Vance, Elara concluded, in a tone that was not accusatory but of pure empathy. Afraid that if you cared you might get hurt. The test wasn't for us. The test was for you, to see if the world was worth the risk of your generosity. Julian was silent. Elara's challenge, wrapped in simple truth and altruism, was the coup de grace his cynicism needed. He finally saw he wasn't the judge in the experiment. He was the defendant, and Elara, the discreet maid, was the only real human being in the room. The silence that followed Elara's challenge was the deepest of the night. Julian, the cold and calculating billionaire, was visibly affected. The veiled accusation of cowardice, delivered with such delicacy, hit him harder than any legal threat from Serena or social contempt from Veronica. He composed himself, but the look in his eyes had changed. The curtain of cynicism had fallen, revealing a tired man desperate for purpose. He looked at Elara and then at the other three who waited tense for punishment or reward. "The three of you," Julian said, addressing Veronica, Serena, and Chloe without emotion in his voice. "You prove that money is not your problem. The problem is your compass. There is no prize for you. There is nothing here I can give you that will change the nature of what you seek. You are dismissed. My security will escort you out." Veronica started to protest, "But Julian, our engagement." "Our engagement," he interrupted her, his voice firm, "was part of my experiment. You sought status. I sought an escape. And we both failed miserably. There is no us. It's over." The three women were escorted out in a whirlwind of silent indignation. The focus remained on Elara and Julian, alone in the projection room. Julian took an object from his inner jacket. It was not an ordinary black card, nor the one Elara had just used. It was a metal card engraved with the name Elara M. Vance, Executive Director. He turned to her. "You asked me why I didn't act, Elara. You are absolutely right. I didn't act because I had no one to trust. I was looking for an asset manager for my Global Impact Foundation, someone who could handle billions of dollars with the same ease that you handled 12 million. Someone who saw money as you do. A tool, a resource to be directed, not consumed." Elara looked at him confused. "Mr. Vance, I'm a cleaner. I dropped out of college. I have no corporate qualification for this." Julian smiled genuinely. "You have more qualifications than anyone with an MBA from Harvard. You have the vision of someone who knows need. You saw the hospital debt as a systemic problem, and your abandoned dream as a chance for others. You bought nothing for yourself, but you bought hope for a community. That is priceless." He held out the card. "The prize is not money, Elara. The prize is power and purpose. I name you Executive Director of my Global Impact Foundation. This card has a symbolic limit, but it is connected to a trust fund with a significant portion of my fortune. You have full power to allocate these funds. As of today, you don't clean my apartment. You help me clean the world." The shock on Elara's face was immense. Julian didn't offer her a fairy tale romance or a raise. He elevated her to his professional level, recognizing her worth beyond any social class or degree, completely subverting the cliché. She won the key to changing the world, the power that Serena so yearned for, but that only Elara's integrity deserved. 6 months later. The final scene was no longer in Julian's penthouse, a symbol of his cynical isolation. It was in a high-rise office, flooded with sunlight and a panoramic view of Manhattan, the new headquarters of the Julian Vance Global Impact Foundation. Elara was unrecognizable in terms of clothing, but identical in essence. She wore an elegant, perfectly tailored gray dress, but kept her hair in her simple bun and, yes, still wore her worn beaded bracelet. She exuded calm confidence, but not arrogance. Julian, sitting at the meeting table beside her, wore a casual blazer. He was more relaxed, less tense. He looked, for the first time in the story, human. They were reviewing complex spreadsheets, discussing the foundation's next step, a massive investment in clean energy technology for developing cities. "With this investment, we can lift over 1 million people out of energy poverty in 5 years. Julian?" Elara explained, pointing to a chart on the screen. "Excellent. The Oracle never predicted he'd be so thrilled to watch his money evaporate," he replied, with a low, genuine laugh, the most real sound he had produced in years. He looked at her, and the look was no longer that of a boss to an employee, nor of a man to a fiancée, but of an equal to an equal, with mutual admiration and respect. Elara smiled, a real smile that lit up her green eyes. "Now you have a much bigger problem than testing people, Mr. Vance. And what would that be?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "How to spend billions of dollars to truly change the world without losing yourself in the process. This is our new game, isn't it?" Julian laughed, a warm, long laugh that finally freed him from his cynicism. He looked at Elara with deep gratitude. He finally realized that the test was not about discovering the women's greed, but about discovering his own need for meaning. He had found it in Elara, the possibility of a romance. It was there, subtly open in the warmth of that last shared look, but it wasn't the focus. What mattered was the partnership, the purpose, the power they now held. The screen slowly fades to black. The audience is left pondering the future. What will Julian and Elara do with so much power? The answer is, they will do what is right. If this plot twist about the true value of wealth touched you, don't keep this reflection to yourself. Share this story with a friend who needs a dose of purpose and, of course, hit the subscribe button right now to join our community that seeks stories with soul and high-concept twists. Until next time.